start with our top story coming out of the U.S., which has announced more sanctions on Iran over its handling of human rights issues. Speaking in Washington, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the U.S. government would freeze the assets of 2 Iranian judges for giving harsh sentences to human rights activists and others. He said Iranian authorities may have killed more than 1,000 anti-government protesters since mid-November. Pompeo said Tehran's human rights violations are unacceptable. He announced Washington will restrict visas for Iranian officials responsible for the crackdown on demonstrators. The U.S. has imposed a series of sanctions on Iranian firms and officials while seeking dialogue with Tehran. Moving on to Lebanon now, where the newly named prime minister has said he will quickly form a government to pull the country out of its economic crisis. He said political and security stability is a cornerstone for the protection of the country. The prime minister said he would address protesters' grievances by making reforms.
I will work hard to form a government as soon as possible through consultation with previous prime ministers, whose opinions and advice I will benefit from, and with parliamentary blocs and lawmakers.
Just yesterday, Diab was named premier with the backing of the Iran-backed Hezbollah and its allies. Now, in news coming out of Libya, Haftar's eastern forces claim that they have launched more than 10 airstrikes against UN-backed government forces in Misrata. In a statement, it said a military camp was also hit. Earlier, Khalifa Haftar's eastern forces warned that they would target any Turkish forces entering Libya. That threat came after the government of national accord approved the implementation of a military deal with Turkey. Previously, Haftar had ordered the start of the final stage of a military campaign to take over Tripoli. In Algeria, Abdelmajid Tebboune has been sworn in as the 8th president of the North African country. After the inauguration, Tebboune accepted the resignation of Prime Minister Noureddin Bedoui. He appointed Sabri Boukadoum as the interim prime minister. Tebboune instructed the rest of the cabinet to stay in office as part of a caretaker government, pending the formation of a new team. Tebboune said discussions on writing a new constitution will begin in a few weeks. He also promised to meet the demands for radical change and the rule of law loudly voiced in 10 months of protests. Algeria has been plagued by wide-scale public demonstrations since February 22nd. Now, the Pakistan Army says unprovoked firing by Indian forces has killed 2 civilians in the Jura sector along the line of control. In a statement, it said 2 others, including a woman, have been wounded. It said 3 soldiers of the Pakistani Army were also wounded in the exchange of fire. Meanwhile, 1 soldier was killed and 4 others were wounded in an IED attack on troops fencing the Pak-Afghan border near Landi Kotal. In India, police have shot dead 3 people as violent protests against the citizenship law continue across the country. 2 people were killed in the southern Karnataka province and 1 other in the northern city of Lucknow. This brings the death toll from the violence to 9 since Parliament passed the citizenship bill on the 10th of December. Protesters are demanding the government repeal the legislation that grants nationality to only non-Muslim immigrants. Meanwhile, police have detained thousands across the country for defying a ban on protests. Prominent historian Ramachandra Guha has also been arrested. Authorities have also suspended mobile networks and internet services in parts of New Delhi and Uttar Pradesh. Meanwhile, the French military has deployed armed drones in Africa's Sahel region as part of its 7-year fight against extremist groups. Defense Minister Florence Parly said the drones were used to provide surveillance support but will now strike targets. She said this is a new capacity, not a change in doctrine. Parly said the American-built Reaper UAVs fitted with laser-guided missiles are part of the Barkhane mission. Earlier this month, militants attacked a military camp in western Niger, which left 71 personnel dead. In other news coming out of Moscow, at least 3 people have been killed in a shooting at the Russian Security Services headquarters. The FSB says the gunman has been neutralized. Russia's health ministry said 5 people were injured in the incident. The shootings took place shortly after President Vladimir Putin held his annual press conference. Authorities have declared the shooting a terrorist incident. In the UK, Brexit negotiations have continually stalled on the question of the Irish border. Since the end of the Northern Ireland conflict in the 1990s, both sides of the divided village reintegrated. Now, Pettigo, a village straddling both sides of the border, is worried about the new challenges Brexit may bring. This report has the details.
Pettigo still has its old customs post, but it's been decades since it was used. The village is divided by the border which runs along the river, with Northern Ireland on the right and the Irish Republic on the left. Since peace talks in the 1990s, crossing has been seamless, with the line in the tarmac the only noticeable change. But things weren't always this way. Mechanic Mervyn Johnston remembers the troubles vividly. His garage is right on the border, and as a former member of the British Army, he was a target for Southern Republicans.
Now, this wasn't the original garage. The original garage is on the other side of the road, and that has been blown up completely twice. And where you're sitting now, this was the post office, and there was a bomb disposal chap killed here defusing a bomb.
Elsewhere in the village, the prospect of Brexit is having some effect. At the post office on the southern side, Northerners have been taking full advantage of their right to apply for Irish EU passports.
Well, after the vote came in, I think it was 2016, very shortly, it doubled fairly quick after that. And it's doubled every year since, and huge interest now since the beginning of this year again.
A few miles away, there's another remnant of the old hard border. The villages of Belcoo and Blacklion used to share a railway station, but the bridge connecting them was blown up in the 1970s by British Army engineers to stop it being used by smugglers. Few here expect Brexit to bring such stark division back, and the hope is that it won't reverse years of deepening integration since the Good Friday peace agreement.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called on the U.S. not to sign a trade deal with China unless Beijing agrees to release 2 detained Canadians. Trudeau said his administration has worked effortlessly in order to secure the Canadians' release. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor have been accused of espionage and have been held in China since 2018. The 2 men were picked up shortly after police in Vancouver held Huawei's chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou on a U.S. arrest warrant. Now, with 51 states, including the United States, still refusing to pay the bulk of their dues to the UN, the world body continues to grapple with its biggest budget deficit in a decade. This could be seen at the recent disarmament talks in Geneva, where new cost-cutting measures forced ambassadors to shout out their speeches without microphones. Details in this report.
The UN is currently struggling with a $768 million deficit in its $2.85 billion budget for 2019. So far this year, 51 states are not up to date on their payments, including 2 of the UN's biggest funders, the United States and Brazil. The organisation is now in the 3rd month of tough budget cuts, which could be seen at last month's disarmament talks in Geneva.
At 6:10, the interpreters left us. And I think the sound engineer also left at 6:25 or 6:30. I think my first experience in my diplomatic career was when I saw the alarms going off at around 6:30.
Ambassadors were reduced to making their speeches under dimmed lights and without microphones. Even the lifts at the UN headquarters building weren't working. The UN Secretary-General warned of this crisis back in October.
These months, we will reach the deepest deficit of the decade. We risk exhausting the closed peacekeeping cash reserves and entering November without enough cash to cover payrolls.
Diplomats and analysts say the crisis underlines the weakening international commitment to multilateralism. They point to last week's UN climate talks in Madrid, reaching only a limited deal as further evidence. This could become a serious problem in the future as the accelerating global climate and refugee crises leave millions vulnerable.
And the news continues after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, conflicts, climate change, and weak economic growth are leaving more people without enough to eat. The United Nations says 168 million people will need food, shelter, or health care in 2020. The world body needs $29 billion to provide help for them. More now on the UN's warning on malnutrition in this report.
New evidence shows the number of people suffering from malnutrition is growing. According to a UN report, a record number of 168 million people will be in need of food, shelter or healthcare assistance in 2020. The UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs says this is the highest number ever registered since the Second World War. He adds the UN needs $29 billion to provide this aid.
In 2020, nearly 168 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection. That represents about 1 person in 45 in the planet. It is the highest figure for decades. The situation is going to keep getting worse unless climate change and the root causes of conflict are better addressed.
Meanwhile, climate change is affecting rainfall patterns and agricultural seasons. Droughts and floods, together with conflicts and economic slowdowns, are key drivers behind malnutrition. Diseases are also on the rise in the most climate-affected region.
Climate change is increasing people's vulnerability to humanitarian crisis. 13 of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change are places in which we have an interagency appeal. Infectious diseases are becoming more prevalent and harder to control because of weak health systems and conflict and lack of access to immunization. In fact, in Africa, in the first 3 months of this year, there were 700% more measles cases than in the same period last year.
Meanwhile, conflicts are directly driving up women and children's mortality and morbidity.
We have also again this year seen a decline in compliance with international humanitarian law. Armed conflicts are killing and maiming a record number of children. More than 12,000 children, in fact, were killed or maimed in conflict in 2018, and 2019 has been worse.
The UN warns if nothing is done to tackle this developing disaster, over 200 million people could be in need of assistance in 2022.
Let's begin business news in the U.S., where the House of Representatives has approved the new North American trade deal. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was passed by 385 votes to 41, replacing the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement. USMCA includes tougher labor and automotive content rules, but leaves over $1 trillion in annual trade flows mostly unchanged. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi gave the USMCA green light last week after striking a deal with the Trump administration. Labor disputes in the new trade deal were one of the sticking points in the negotiations.
Virtually almost every union is supporting the agreement, and there's a reason for that. This is a significant improvement over the original NAFTA. It is a significant improvement over the NAFTA that Donald Trump brought back to us. The agreement he brought back to us was totally unenforceable. It would have been a little tweaking of the old NAFTA.
Well, this trade deal was first agreed upon in September 2018, but the U.S. Congress insisted on major changes to labor and environmental provisions. The pact, which must be ratified by lawmakers in all three countries, still faces a vote in the Republican-majority U.S. Senate. On to Asia now, where the stock markets are trading mixed as their U.S. counterparts broke a new record with positive news on the trade front, boosting sentiments. Investors are closely monitoring the new North American trade deal that was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. Hong Kong's Hang Seng and Seoul's Kospi are trading fractionally higher. The Shanghai Composite Index rose 0.2% at the end of the morning session. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 has lost a fraction as Japan's auto sector stocks plunged. Toyota, Nissan, Suzuki, and Mitsubishi tumbled nearly 1% each, while Mazda has declined over 0.5%. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And with that, you're all caught up. Thank you for watching this bulletin here on Indus News.